Hi, everyone. Stefan Schuster here, and welcome to this episode of the Journey Running Podcast. Really happy to have you guys back for another great episode. Today is Wednesday, October 12th. I'm not sure what day exactly this episode is going to end up coming out, as I have one interview that still needs to be released with my friend Dave Bronlick, and then I have a few other upcoming interviews as well. Nonetheless, for those of you who know me, I am a nutrition grad student, and I did a project recently that, while the information is fresh on my mind, because I just presented about this topic for grad school, I wanted to make sure that I recorded a podcast because I think that people outside of not only in my grad program might have found this topic interesting, but I think other, especially ultra runners, might find this topic interesting as well. And that topic is nutrition strategies for type 1 diabetics to compete in ultramarathon events. And so the class that I'm in is it's heavily like research based. So what we had to do for this course was create what's called a literature review. And a literature review is when you look over current literature about a certain subject and you dig into all the research and you try to come up with a summary of conclusions that exists about a certain topic. And so one thing I just want to preface this conversation with is this is just a literature review project that I did for class. I don't want people to take this information and use it in the field. I am not a licensed health practitioner. I do not have my registered dietitian status yet. But I thought that it was still an interesting topic that I think other people will enjoy hearing and learning about as well. And so for this project, really the purpose of doing this research is because exercise itself for individuals with type 1 diabetes has been shown to improve a lot of different areas of their life. It has been shown to help improve weight status, lower insulin needs, lower blood pressure, and also reduce cardiovascular risks for individuals with type 1 diabetes. And that's really important right there because cardiovascular disease is actually the number one cause of death for individuals who have type 1 diabetes. And so with that stated, some type 1 diabetics strive not only, though, to use exercise in the general, like exercise is always recommended for individuals with diabetes, but some people want to use exercise not only for the health purposes, but also for passion and fulfillment, kind of just like the rest of us do as ultra runners, considering the vast majority of individuals in the sport do not have diabetes. But in the cases where individuals with type 1 diabetes want to take that passion to the next level, there are those general exercise guidelines that they can follow, but there aren't any guidelines at the moment that really cover extreme endurance sports. And so there's actually one study that I think stated that really well, which is that current healthcare professional advice does not match patient ambition and practice, which is the quote, in regard to those instances. And so because of that, the purpose of my lit review for class was to dissect the current literature that's been completed regarding nutrition strategies for type 1 diabetics to participate in endurance sporting events. And some people who are listening to this, I should have gone over this first maybe, might not recall the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. So type 1 diabetes is essentially when your body does not have the ability to produce insulin. And because of that, you have to take exogenous insulin, usually in the form of an insulin shot. So that's why people take shots. Whereas type 2 diabetes is related to insulin resistance, where your body has an issue being able to recognize insulin. And so just to go over that process real quickly for everyone, really, the way your body absorbs glucose, so sugar, when you eat carbohydrates, essentially, is that when you consume carbohydrates and the glucose enters your bloodstream, it cannot just enter your cells. For example, if we have a red blood cell and you have that red blood cell that wants to use glucose for energy, because inside the cell it will turn glucose into something called ATP, which is your body's primary source of energy. there's all these processes that go into converting glucose into ATP. Not going to get into that today, but there's a process that needs to be followed for your body to take that glucose and get that glucose into a red blood cell. And that's where insulin comes in. So when you consume a meal, insulin levels rise. Now, what does that mean? When insulin levels rise, insulin is essentially a key that opens a door for glucose to get into your cells. So insulin will bind to a cell. It'll say, hey, we need you to open this door so glucose can enter the cell. And when glucose enters the cell, then the cell can use glucose for energy. So when your body has insulin resistance, that means that it's not recognizing insulin. And when your body doesn't recognize insulin, you can't turn the key. You're missing the key to open the door so that glucose can get into the cell. So if your body is insulin resistant, just because you're eating carbohydrates doesn't mean your body can use that, like absorb that glucose into the cells. And that's how you end up with things like hyperglycemia, because then if you have all this glucose running around your bloodstream, but it can't enter cells, then you have really high blood glucose, and that in itself can be dangerous. And I'll get into defining that a little bit more. Nonetheless, the research question that I tried my best to answer for this project was, what nutrition strategies can endurance athletes with type 1 diabetes utilize to safely manage hyper and hypoglycemia during competition? And before I continue, there's a few things that I want to better define here in my research question, because when you're doing research, you need to be very critical and precise. And so first off, when I say what nutrition strategies can athletes use, I'm going to define a nutrition strategy as a nutrition-based plan that can be replicated. And the key word here is replicated, that safely allows type 1 diabetics to complete endurance events. And when we look at a nutrition strategy and we want to define it as a success or a failure, we're going to define success, a strategy, as a success if athletes can complete their event, their endurance event that they're doing, and do so safely. And then that leads me to say that an endurance event, for the purpose of this literature review, is defined as any cardiovascular dominant form of exercise that requires 3 or more hours to complete. And then lastly, hypoglycemia, for the purpose of this literature review, is defined as blood glucose levels under 70 milligrams per deciliter, and then hyperglycemia is defined as levels above 250 milligrams per deciliter. And so hyperglycemia, like I said, is high blood glucose levels. Hypoglycemia is low blood glucose levels. And when you're a type 1 diabetic who's exercising, your body oftentimes has trouble managing that glucose in your bloodstream, because if you take too much insulin while you're exercising, you can end up, or if you have too little carbohydrate intake while you're exercising, you can end up with blood glucose levels under that 70 milligram per deciliter range. And that's really where very dangerous, that's really where type 1 diabetics can experience a lot of danger and fear around exercising, because they don't want to, you don't, no sport or activity is worth dying or serious health complications. But also a few notes about the studies. Key search terms for those interested. I used my school's library and Google Scholar to find the research articles. I'll make sure to post the references in the podcast notes. But overall, I started out looking at 17 studies for this literature review, and was able to narrow that down to 4 that pertain to my research question. All the studies that I looked at were within the 2018 to 2022 time range. And that's actually not because I just looked at that time range. I looked at articles like before 2018 as well, but none of the articles from 2018 or before 2018 really presented any information about the solving my art research question that I was trying to look at. And so I think that's interesting also, because that probably means that researchers are more so starting to try to solve the question of like what strategies can type 1 diabetics follow if they want to do an ultramarathon or an ultra cycling event or like an Ironman or something like that. So yeah, I think that's when I did this project in class, somebody asked me about that, and they said, "Why do you think that all the research has been done more recently?" And I just think it's because the amount of participants in endurance sports is rising. As you could imagine, I mean, in ultramarathon running, we only have about 100,000 finishers in the U.S. We're probably going to have about that this year in 2022. And as you could imagine, a very small fraction of that is type 1 diabetics. But as the sport grows, we're going to have more people who are type 1 diabetics or even have type 2 diabetes and want to be a participant in this sport. And just because there's not a lot of them, that doesn't mean that the subject isn't important. I think that everyone who participates in ultramarathon events can say that ultra running is a really big part of our lives. At least I know it is for me. And just because there's a few people with this, I guess we could call it a problem, that doesn't mean that it's not important, because this is their lives and ultra running might be really important to them. And so we want to make sure that we can get them to the finish line safely, assuming that's possible. But I think that we'll see that that is possible as I go over some of these studies that I looked at for class. But without further ado, let's dive into some of the literature. I'm just going to preface this conversation as we go through the articles with, I didn't necessarily come to any extreme conclusions. There's not much guidelines based off the current literature that we can really, there's no great conclusions that we can come to based off this literature, but it is a great start. And if I had type 1 diabetes, I would want to be aware of this information so that I can see where the literature is right now and maybe use that as that information to help myself run races if I was in that situation. But so let's get into the articles. The first article that I looked at was it is titled Prevention of Exercise-Induced Hypoglycemia in 12 Patients with Type 1 Diabetes Running the Paris Marathon Using Continuous Glucose Monitoring, a prospective single-center observational study. So what's important about this study, I'm not going to go into every single detail about every study. That would take hours probably, but I'm going to pull out the important details and what I think differentiated each study. So in this study, we had 12 patients with type 1 diabetes who participated in 3 races. There were 2 pre-races, and then they also participated in the Paris Marathon. And so the nutrition strategy, one thing that I really liked about this study was that there was a nutrition strategy vaguely listed. This was actually the only study that I looked at that had a nutrition strategy before the race. And so just to clarify once again, what I'm looking for in this literature review is nutrition strategies for athletes during the race. And the key word here is during, not looking at before, not looking at after. But we do need to realize that it's important to remember that we can't create guidelines for athletes to participate in events if everybody is starting the race at a different glycemic threshold. For example, if you have one athlete starting with low glycemia and one with high glycemia, they can't follow the same strategy in the race because they're starting at 2 different points. And this was the only study that actually had the athletes consume breakfast 3 hours before the marathon, and it was the only study that actually looked at starting blood sugar range. And so this study asked participants, or tried their best to work with participants to make sure that their blood glucose was within the range of 140 to 300 milligrams per deciliter. And some of you might be thinking, well, Stefan, earlier you defined hyperglycemia, which is too much blood glucose, too high blood glucose, as over 250 milligrams per deciliter. And the reason that I think they used the 300 as the upper threshold for before starting this race was because it's actually recommended in nutrition guidelines right now that before exercising, type 1 diabetics reduce their insulin take by 80 to 100%, 30 to 60 minutes before exercise. Now, why would you do that? So the reason that that's recommended is because you want your body to be a little bit, you want your body to have a higher amount of blood glucose before you start exercise, so that when you do start exercising, you have a lot of energy that can be burned from the bloodstream. But the other thing I want to note is that in the 2 pre-races before the Paris Marathon, which was the main event that this study was focusing on, the researchers said that they individualized carbohydrate and insulin strategy for each athlete. But what was really weird was that they didn't actually go into what that strategy was. Instead, they only listed average carbohydrate intake during the study as 33.9 grams per hour during the marathon. And for reference, the marathon took all participants about 3.5 to 5.5 hours to complete. But yeah, they didn't list any sort of macronutrient breakdown. They didn't list where the carbs came from. They just listed 33.9 grams per hour of carbohydrate intake during the marathon. And for reference, carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram. So if you do the math, that's about 140 calories an hour during the marathon that the athletes intook. And they said that that was all carbohydrate based, which is also a little bit weird because most athletes are consuming more of a variety of macronutrients during races. But that is the first study and the strategy that was used. So in the second study that I looked at was a little bit different. They actually did not monitor nutrition, which was a little frustrating, but I thought that they had a good philosophy for their nutrition strategy that the athletes used. So this study was titled A 150-Mile Ultra Endurance Type 1 Diabetes Cycling Event, Qualitative Analysis of Knowledge, Preparation, and Management Strategies. So in this study, once again, 12 participants with type 1 diabetes were participating in this study, and the nutrition strategy that they used was not very scientific, really. And the strategy that they used was the participants said, "We are cyclists first and diabetics second." So they were basically, their strategy was essentially trial and error. And they used past experience plus what's called continuous glucose monitoring. I'm just going to call it CGM for the rest of this podcast. CGM is, so once again, continuous glucose monitoring. That's when you essentially have a monitor that is attached to your body that can tell you in real time where your blood sugar is. I guess I say real time, but it's about 15 minutes of lagging. So what participants do is they look at their blood sugar and they look at the trend line. If the trend is going up or down, they make adjustments to the insulin and to the carbohydrate intake that they're using during the race so that they can stay within a healthy 70 to 250 milligram per deciliter threshold of blood glucose. What was cool about the study was the average participant was 41 years old and had an average of 23 years as a diabetic. So I think that's really what allowed their strategy to focus on allowing participants to just use their past experience to help them fuel for the races. The problem, though, with using experience as the nutrition strategy is that everybody has different experience as a diabetic. And because of that, we defined a nutrition strategy as something that could be replicatable, right? For an event. And so we can't recommend a strategy of experience when everybody in the world has different experiences in general. So not necessarily a great strategy to recommend. But I mean, just like in the Paris Marathon, I should have mentioned this in the last study, everybody in the Paris Marathon and study and everybody in this 150-mile ultra endurance cycling event finished their race successfully. So I think it's good to know that it is possible for diabetics to be able to finish these races and do so safely because everybody finished safely. The problem is we can't create standards that replicate a strategy based off of experience. We could tell people CGM is definitely recommended to help you make your nutrition decisions wisely, though. So the third study that I looked at was titled Safe Completion of a Trail Running Ultramarathon by 4 Men with Type 1 Diabetes. And so in this study, 4 participants completed an 82-kilometer ultramarathon. 82 kilometers is equivalent to about 50 miles. And this was really a mountain race. It had 10,000 feet of vertical gain and loss. Once again, the nutrition strategy for this study revolved around using past experience plus CGM to allow participants to finish the race. This study did not measure macronutrient intake. However, it did list a few really interesting data points, I think. The first one was it did list the carbohydrate intake that each of the 4 subjects consumed during the race. And so that number was 36 grams, 47 grams, 29 grams, and 36 grams of carbohydrates an hour on average for each subject during the race. And the race took about 13 to 15 and a half hours. I think it was 13 and a half to 15 and a half hours for each participant to complete the race. And yes, that's how many carbs that they intook. The other thing that was interesting about this study was that it did note blood glucose levels at certain checkpoints throughout the race. And I just want to highlight this point once again, which is that the participants started the race with very different blood glucose levels. And like we said before, you can't create a general guideline for people to follow if everyone's starting at a different starting point, right? And so in this study, subjects started with glucose levels of 102, which is a normal range, and 108, which is also a normal range, but then also 480, which is extremely hyperglycemic. We defined hyperglycemia as over 250 milligrams a deciliter. So one participant started with 480 though, and another started with 290. So two of the participants here started very hyperglycemic. And I just think it's important as we move forward and do more research that researchers either decide, because there are guidelines as to what range type 1 diabetics should start their exercise with, but are those guidelines also recommended for endurance events in the way that we're defining endurance events? And if so, future studies need to do a better job making sure that participants are starting within a smaller range. That way we can create strategies that will help everybody and not just, they can't just be all over the place, right? Or I guess we have a strategy that says if you're starting the race very hyperglycemic, use this strategy. If you're starting within range, use this. If you're starting hypoglycemic, use this. Hopefully you're not starting hypoglycemic though. And the last study that I looked at was titled Nutritional Strategies of an Athlete with Type 1 Diabetes Mellitus During a 217-kilometer ultramarathon, aka the race that this study focused on was the Brazil 135 ultramarathon. I should note that this study was actually a case study, which means that there was only one participant who was 36 years old in the study. It took this participant 51 hours to complete the 135-mile race. And once again, we're starting to see this as a theme, is that this participant used experience plus glucose monitoring to fuel his nutrition-related decisions during the event. During this race, the participant consumed 3,592 calories during the race. And that's to do the math for people. If he took 51 hours to complete the race, that means he averaged about 70 calories per hour, which is really low. And he only consumed 10.4 grams of carbohydrates an hour, which is also extremely low. But he finished. That said, he did have one instance of hypoglycemia and 4 instances of hyperglycemia during the race, but he finished. And this was the only study that actually showed a breakdown of all macronutrients, and so that's carbohydrates, proteins, fats. But yeah, not a very high intake of protein and fat. The vast majority of the calories were taken from carbohydrates in this study as well. So as we move forward, there's a lot of limitations in the research that I did find. Obviously, we cannot create guidelines based off of what I just went over, but there's a lot of limitations. I mean, namely, just in the 4 studies that I looked at, there were only 29 individuals over the course of all 4 studies that participated in each study, and the vast majority of the participants were male. So not a lot of diversity there. There's just a large lack of research on this subject. Another limitation was the differing pre-race blood glucose levels, and another limitation was that the studies measured very different metrics. I mean, only one in the 4 studies actually measured all 3 macronutrients that the athlete intook, and that was just the case study, so we only have one individual we can look at that for. So as I'm reviewing all this information, the research claim that I came up with to answer my research question for the class that I did this original project for was that there is very little research regarding nutrition strategies for type 1 diabetics competing in endurance events to utilize. Due to the lack of research, participants in this review primarily fueled by using personal experience and CGM systems. And while those tools can be influential for nutrition strategy, more research is needed to create precise nutrition guidelines for the subset of athletes. Therefore, no research claim can be made. So, once again, I hope you guys find this information interesting, but there's really not a lot of research on the subject. So the whole goal of this project is to just explain the information that we do have at hand so that we can move forward with studies that I think the next steps would be to find that recommended guideline for blood glucose ranges to begin a race with. And then the step after that would be, once we have participants start within a more defined threshold, then we actually look at strategies. I mean, one thing that's great about all this research is that it shows that all 29 out of 29 participants completed the events that they participated in. And so that means that type 1 diabetics can complete ultra endurance events and do so safely. We just need to come up with more precise guidelines, because, I mean, the sample size here is really small to say that if we had 1 million individuals in these studies start and 1 million finish, it's just unlikely that that would happen, and it's unlikely that all of them would do it safely, considering that there's no precise guidelines that have been created or can be created based off the research so far. So we have a lot of work to do, but I hope that you guys find this interesting, and I hope that I hope that this just helps give people an idea of where the research is at. But nonetheless, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you guys so much for listening in. If you have any nutrition-related questions, feel free to reach out. Once again, I'm just a graduate student. I am on my second year of attaining my master's degree in nutrition from Metropolitan State University here in Denver, Colorado. And then after I'm done with my degree, I will be pursuing a dietetic internship, and then hopefully down the road starting my own practice as a RDN. But once again, you can reach out to me at journeyrunning.llc@gmail.com if you have any questions, thoughts, concerns. You can also check out the website journeyruncoaching.com. There you can find out a lot more about myself and my business, Journey Run Coaching. I am a ultramarathon endurance running coach, and I have an entire curriculum listed on my website if you're interested in seeing all of the topics that I can cover with you. I do believe that I can make anyone a better runner, so if you're interested in coaching, please do reach out. Lastly, you can follow us at Journey Running on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. But thank you guys so much for listening to another episode. I hope you found this interesting, and have a great rest of your day.